Welcome to Raised on D&D podcast. Twice a month, Raised on D&D brings you inspirational interviews, tips, and strategies to enhance your family's gaming experience. Your host for Raised on D&D has been a game master for 30 years and father to 3 gamers. Here is Nick Cardarelli.
Welcome back, gamers. I'm your host, Nick Cardarelli, and this is Raised on D&D. My next guest hails from the frozen wasteland of North Dakota. He's the founder of Gallant Knight Games, an award-winning game designer, and a best-selling publisher. He has recently released Tiny Cthulhu, the minimalist cosmic horror RPG. Please welcome Alan Bahr. Hi, Alan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. So, Alan, we're super excited to talk to you about all the things that you got coming down the pipe at Gallant Knight Games. But before we jump into all that, can you take us back, tell us about your first experience with tabletop role-playing games and how your passion started?
Yeah, so my first experience would have been in scout camp. I was 12, 13 maybe. You know, we were away from home at a camp and some folks were playing this game around the campfire. And I was like, oh, that sounds fun. I want to join in. And they let me join in. And it was just downhill from there, really.
You're away at camp and tell us what happened. Somebody broke out the old red box. What was it like?
No, we were playing either 3.0. We had to have been playing 3.0. It was in that brief period before 3.5 came out. They were all sitting around this table playing, and I went over and they had books and dice, and I was reading fantasy books at the time. And so I saw, dragons and stuff. Like, oh, this sounds great. And
now, are these peers, or are these all Eagle Scouts digging deep into D&D?
We shared our campsite with multiple troops in the area, so they were not from my troop. I never saw them again.
Wow. So just that one-time game, and then they were gone. So yeah. What happens when you get back from camp and you're like, boy, I need more of that Dungeons and Dragons stuff?
Well, I grew up in North Dakota, and we had one game store, and they sold dice, but not D&D books, to the best of my knowledge. And I could be wrong now, but so I remember saving my allowance money, lawn mowing job, what have you. And at some point I rode my bike to a Walden Books. Hopefully most of you know who that is, or I'm going to feel really old. But it was in this little bookstore, and I bought all 3 core books, and they were the 3.5 core books, because at that point 3.5 was out. And I bought a bunch of the old prepackaged randomized D&D mini boosters.
Yes.
And specifically I bought them because it was the set that had Dritz and his Panther. And I had just finished reading those books. And I was like, oh, they're probably the super rares, but I'll buy 3 boosters and maybe I'll get one, because that's all the money I had. And I got both of them out of that pack.
Wow.
I was so excited. I had them for years, and I lost them recently.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, man.
Well, folks, if you're listening at home, Alan's lost his Dritz and I think it's Guinevere. So if you got those minis, you just mail them to Alan. You find Gallant Knight Games PO box.
I'll give you tons of free RPG books.
So you get the books. You're in North Dakota. You've pedaled all the way to Walden Books. You've got the core games. And what happens after that? Do you start banding people together? No.
I didn't play till I went to college.
Really? Wow.
We played there were some false starts with kids at school or whatnot. With beginner boxes or whatever. I remember the first time we tried playing over lunch at school, and I spent the entire session rolling a D12 instead of a D20 for my attack rolls. I could never figure out why I couldn't hit anything. I wasn't too terribly thrilled about that. But, I had the books. I made loads of characters. I read them ad nauseum, but there was nobody in town. And, it was a rural kind of farming community town.
So you head off to college, and what happens? You find all of these gamer people.
Kind of. I was in a dorm, and I was rooming with this one person, and I didn't know anybody in this room. We were all kind of randomly assigned this dorm. And halfway through the semester, one of our roommates left. because I went to Brigham Young University, which is a Mormon college. And so he went on his mission for 2 years.
Oh, okay.
And so we got a replacement roommate. And that gentleman, a buddy of mine named Tom, who I'm still friends with to this day, emailed talking about how much he loved D&D. And one of our roommates was like, he sounds like a nerd. I'll give you $20 a room with him. I was like, great. I have D&D books in my closet. I made $20 and it's a hobby I like. Tom, if you're listening, I don't know if I ever told you the story. I'm sorry. But it's a true story. I got paid to be your roommate, but then we became friends. So it's okay.
That is awesome.
And then we started a campaign, and I don't think I ever stopped playing.
That is fantastic. So fast forwarding, you are now the owner of Gallant Knight Games. And by the way, I love your website. I've bought all kinds of things. I just purchased Tiny Supers, so I was really excited about that. I haven't gotten to play it yet, but I love the artwork and I love the layout. I'm really excited to explore Tiny Dungeons. Tell us real quickly, how did you go from just being in love with D&D to saying, you know what, I think I have my own publishing company? How did you make that transition?
Those of you who are too young to know might not remember the heady days of the Wizards of the Coast forums in the 2000s. But they would have these sort of fan-driven design competitions. Design a character, design an adventure site, whatever. And I was always like, I'm going to do them. And they were terrible. They were so bad. I never got close to winning anything. And eventually somebody who was running these things, and I couldn't tell you who they were for the life of me, and I always regret this, but they reached out and they said, look, you keep submitting. You're clearly not going to stop. So why don't I give you some advice? And they gave me some advice, and I listened, and I kind of kept doing it. And all the way, after college, kept playing games, kept kind of just hacking at games. And a friend of mine, Howard Taylor, who does the Schlock Mercenary webcomic, which is a science fiction webcomic, knew I was into kind of the amateur design side, and he wanted to do a Schlock Mercenary RPG. And so he came to me and said, hey, what would you pitch me? And I pitched him this off-the-wall D6-based system with cards and things that go crazy. And he loved it, and we made the game, and it did $340,000 on Kickstarter back in 2015.
Wow.
And I wrote all the rules for that book. With the rest of the team giving input and helping me improve them. And after that, I was like, this was fun. I can keep doing this. And so I started Gallant Knight Games.
Wow. That's incredible. And I remember those competitions. I loved watching them, and I downloaded everybody's submissions that made to the thing to keep in my back pocket as a dungeon master. I don't think I submitted anything. I was too intimidated back then. And
I was too young to be intimidated. But if I was a little bit older and wiser, I would have been.
But it was so much fun, and I loved the creative energy of those competitions. Just seeing everybody, and it would narrow down. It was like a reality show for us, so it was really great. Now you're a husband.
I am,
and accused of being a responsible adult. Is that correct?
The charge has been levied against me, though no one has been able to make it stick.
Well, we wanted to ask you now. Tiny Dungeon is a phenomenal game, and you and your creative team have worked hard and put that together, and you come out with a second edition. Now, for a lot of folks who aren't familiar with Tiny Dungeon, what I like most about it is not only is it a streamlined mechanics, but you're only using 1 to 3 6-sided dice. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. We call the engine the Tiny D6 engine.
Tiny D6 engine. And that's great. One of the things Raised on D&D, we don't just talk about our own journey to being passionate about tabletop role-playing games, but also we talk about sharing that with children. Now, the Tiny D6 engine isn't specifically geared towards a younger audience. It can be used with any composition of players. But what I liked about it was because it was streamlined, because you're only using a few dice, and like you mentioned earlier, you're not getting confused between the D12 and the D20. You don't have 7 to 9 dice to choose from. it makes it a lot easier. And now you have a variety of options. You've got the fantasy line. You've got the supers, like I mentioned, I was very excited about. You've got Cthulhu horror that just came out. What other lines do you have for Tiny D6 engine?
So the first one was Tiny Frontiers, which is science fiction, kind of a space opera game.
Okay.
And there's a revised edition of that out now. Tiny Frontiers revised. There's also Tiny Wastelands, which is a post-apocalyptic game. It's got a Mad Max kind of vibe to it. There's rules for vehicles and vehicle combat, as well as like scavenging and stuff like that.
Very cool.
Mutations, all that good stuff. And then we also have Mechas and Monsters, which is a giant robot and kaiju game. You can play as the giant robots or the kaiju. So if you ever wanted to get your Godzilla on, that game will let you play the kaiju.
Awesome.
And then we have a bunch of smaller ones: Tiny Living Dead, Tiny Gunslingers, Tiny Pirates. Knights of Underbed just came out from our partner at Warner Wonderworks, and it's a Tiny D6 game where you play stuffed animals protecting the dreams of children.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. And, you know, a lot of our listeners, they do have the elementary age crowd at their table, but also they have the teenagers and the young adults also at home gaming with them. It's a good mix. And what I like is the Tiny D6 engine can be used with all those different genres, and it can be used for any of those age groups that our listeners might be playing with. So that's fantastic. Right. Now, Alan, we were talking earlier and you mentioned that you have some experience gaming with children. Is that right?
Yeah. So I've served as a consultant. There's a game design merit badge you can get as a Boy Scout now. I don't know where that was when I was in Boy Scouts, but it's a thing now. And so I've been a counselor for that at times. I've done classes and seminars for high school down through middle school students who want to talk about games. I've ran events for kids at gaming conventions. We've donated products to libraries and events at libraries, all sorts of things like that. Yeah, we play with the younger audience a lot. We even have a game, Tiny Dungeon Hatchling Edition, which was written by parents with their kids so kids could pick it up and run Tiny Dungeon.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Now, Alan, you and your wife don't have any children of your own as of yet, but you mentioned that you have been active in foster care in the past. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we've done foster care, primarily serving as, and I forget the term, a way station. So when the children are taken to be placed and they don't have anywhere to go, they'd stay with us until they moved on to their family they're staying with long term.
I see. And
respite. That's what they call it, respite.
And what kind of age groups did you normally have?
Most of them were younger, 10 or less.
Okay.
But it would just depend on the situation.
When you are that home before placement, how long would they normally be with you?
We generally no more than 2 weeks.
About 2 weeks. Okay.
Yeah.
There are listeners who are passionate about tabletop gaming, and we've talked about over the seasons with organizers, educators, librarians, folks who don't have children of their own, but they want to share tabletop role-playing games with young people. What are what's some advice or challenges that you've experienced when gaming with kids, whether it was at conventions or in your own home?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is both the biggest advantage, frankly. They're kind of hand in hand. Kids are enormously creative. And I think as adults, we tend to lose sight of that. We feel locked or structured. I remember being younger and I just gamed. It didn't need to make sense. We didn't ask why something was happening. That we were just like, that's what it is. This person is a wizard. This person is a robot fighter man. And, this person is probably a dragon of some kind. And we just went with it. We didn't worry about backstories or narrative. And those things are important. But I think as adults, we tend to lock ourselves into this is how we have to do it. The listeners can't see me gesturing with my hands in a rail-like fashion, but I'm doing that. And, children, they don't have that. If the kid wants to play, one of the heritages in Tiny Dungeon is the glitter bug. And what it is, it's just a beetle with a shiny shell, and it dances around and distracts people and blinds them. That's all. That's like its big thing. And it was written because a fan on Twitter who has a child who is, and I believe they are autistic. It's been a couple of years. I don't recall specifically. Reached out and said, "Hey, this game seems really easy to hack. This is what my kid wants to play. Do you have any advice?" And I was like, well, that's great. That's a cool idea. And so on Twitter, I like dashed off the rules and just replied, because Tiny Dungeon, you can write a heritage in a tweet and send it. And I was like, here it is. And I'm like, also, we're going to print it in the next Tiny Zine because this is pretty cool. And we got some art and stuff. And that wouldn't exist if the kid hadn't been like, I want to play a shiny bug. And so as a GM, you have to enable that passionate imagination, right? It's unbridled, it's raw. It's this just churning, crazy imagination that out of left field half the time it feels like. But also kids are they're so willing to bend and flex their imagination in ways you never expect, but they also play by the rules, right? It has to make sense to them on some level. And it doesn't have to be the same level as an adult. And so as a GM, that can be hard to balance. You have to give them enough room to really spread out and be imaginative while still making sure, the one really pushy imaginative kid isn't overriding everybody else or isn't demanding that everybody else's imagination adhere to their core principles of what they see as right, And even more so than with adults can be sensitive, but it can be really hard to balance that personality clash with children because they don't have the experience and the knowledge and the social interactions at times to kind of understand where you're coming from as the adult.
Absolutely. So so Alan, you're saying that dungeon masters, especially when you're working with younger kids at the game table, you just got to be flexible. You got to be open, and you got to be, I would say, permissive in letting them explore their imagination. And I think the funniest example I have is actually my sister-in-law was a teenager, and my wife and I were introducing her to Dungeons and Dragons. And so I use the basic fantasy trope. You two are adventurers, and you're going to a bar, to a tavern to get a job. Yeah. Well, my teenager sister-in-law says, great. I go up to the bartender and I tell him we're looking for a job. And the bartender, being misogynist, says to the female adventurers, well, we're hiring waitresses. And they're supposed to be offended, right? They're supposed to be, hey, wait a second, I'm a hero. And they said, okay, I'll take the job as a waitress. And I was like, oh, she doesn't understand the game. So I was like, no, you're supposed to be looking for adventures like bounties and monsters to fight and things like that. And she says, well, waitresses hear everyone's conversations at their tables. So if someone's talking about a cave with treasure or a monster, I'm the one who's going to find out first because I'm a waitress. And I went, well, I guess that's right. And that was you were talking about being stuck in that box. You were like, oh, well, D&D works this way. And she looked at the situation. She went, oh, no, that's a way of making it work. And 100 other examples like that. But that's how young people and even adults who are new to the game will surprise a dungeon master with their ideas.
Yeah, I think there's value in ensuring that you have a wide spread of people playing your game with varying experience levels, because it will force you to play a game a different way, in a way you wouldn't think.
Now, I like to introduce at least a half a dozen people a year to tabletop role-playing games, depending on their interest of genre, things like that. But I love having the new player at the table. It does a couple of things for me. It helps the other players see from a different perspective. But as a dungeon master, it makes me describe things a little bit harder. But I don't just say a hobgoblin. I've got to use some adjectives in there so that they know what we're talking about. But that fresh perspective makes for a great game table. And I think that a streamlined system like the Tiny D6 engine is definitely something that would help expand the gaming hobby and bring that to more people who are interested, but maybe intimidated by the deep rules of something like D20 or even 3.0 and 3.5 like we grew up on.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting you mentioned that. So my wife and I were dating when 5th edition came out. And she'd played RPGs back when she was in high school briefly, but she hadn't done it in a long time. And she knew I was really into it. And she wanted to play. And so we were going to do Pathfinder. And then I decided not to after we tried to make characters. And then we were going to do Shadowrun, and a similar result occurred. And so we actually ended up playing Pendragon as our first major campaign.
Wow.
And and this is what I loved about Pendragon, and it's almost my go-to to teach people RPGs now, is because if you're familiar with Pendragon, you'll understand what I'm about to say. If you're unfamiliar, Pendragon has personality traits that are on your character sheet, and they are paired personalities. So, for example, you would have merciful, and it would be paired against cruel. They're sort of these opposite personalities. And the way it works is each personality has a rating. And between the two personalities, the ratings will equal 20. So if I have a 15 in merciful, I have a 5 in cruel. Mm-hmm. They always equal 20. And the higher your personality trait, the more dominant it is in your personality. And at a certain point, if you want to act against it, you have to make a test. So if I wanted to be cruel and had a merciful 15, I would have to roll a d20. And if I rolled a 15 or less, I would have to be merciful because my merciful is my overriding trait.
Wow.
But what happens is when we're playing and somebody is stuck with their character, I can point at their character sheet and go, what is your biggest trait? What's your highest personality? Oh, well, it's justice. Okay, so how do you think somebody who really believes in justice would respond to the situation here? And boom, we're in. Or, hey, your lord, your knight, your lord is asking you to do this task. And they're like, well, I don't want to do this. It sounds dangerous. Well, what's your loyalty lord? Oh, well, it's an 18 out of 20. So do you think you're going to do it? Well, yeah, I'm really loyal. I better do it. And so it put these kind of these guide rails or these handrails around the idea of role-playing where I could point to something on the character sheet that made mathematical sense. Mm-hmm. And they would understand how to interpret that into role-playing and approaching character thought.
That is phenomenal.
And so it was a really eye-opening running that, because I've taught people RPGs for years. I could dozens of people how to play RPGs. And until I used Pendragon, it kind of clicked that there was this, I was like, oh, Pendragon has built these tools right here on the character sheet. And that sort of started if you read in my books, you'll hear me say this a lot, that if it's not on the character sheet as a mechanic, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Right? And it's a weird thing for me as a minimalist game designer to say, right? And I realize the irony in what I'm saying, but it's also true. If it doesn't matter to the game, it's not on the character sheet. And so something like Tiny D6, you have that permission to go wild and do whatever you want, be a glittering bug, because the character sheet doesn't say you can't. Right? Whereas if you play something like D&D, when I look at that skill list, I know what this game's about. Those skill list tells me everything I need to know about a game. When I pick up a new game, I look at the skill list. Right? What should people be rolling in this game? Mm-hmm. Right? And so if I see lots of stuff like open lock, stealth, ancient history, find trap, I'm like, oh, this is a dungeon crawling game. Mm-hmm. That's what this game is about. So when you look at Tiny Dungeon and you look at the trait list, there's a lot of traits that deal with dungeons, but there's also a lot that deal with things outside of combat. And that's explicit. That's core to the design, because What's on the character sheet is how the player is telling you as the GM what they want to do, and it's how the game is telling the player what the game is about.
That is terrific. I'm very excited. I don't have my copy of Tiny Cthulhu as of yet, but what I can tell you is just recently in October, I introduced my children and my wife to the Call of Cthulhu from Chaosium for the very first time. We used the starter box, and to my surprise, I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be fun. I knew that they would enjoy it. I thought that it would be scary. We tried the we didn't try the starter box's adventure. We actually went with the Haunting, that classic adventure, and we had a great time doing it. But to my surprise, my wife said it was the most fun she'd ever had role playing, which was a shock because we've had lots of games together, and the second surprise was my oldest, my daughter, said, I would like to run Call of Cthulhu. I would like to become a keeper. And I was like, okay, well, I did not anticipate either of those reactions, such strong reactions. So when Tiny Cthulhu came out earlier and I saw it, I said, you know what? A minimalist rule set might be ideal for her to start on that path to becoming a keeper. Now, Alan, would you say that that's a good place for my daughter to start?
I mean, yes, buy my game. Start there. That sounds great to me. That's what I'm supposed to say, right?
Right.
Tiny D6 is a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderfully rules-light system, but by the virtue of being rules-light, there is not a lot of hand-holding for GMs in a lot of ways. So it can be very hard if you have no experience with RPGs to just pick up and run. Mm-hmm. Which is why we have a bunch of free starter adventures and PDFs and stuff that we offer that are kind of introductory things. But if you just have the book, there's no introductory adventure in the book.
But that's all on GallantKnightGames.com, right?
Correct. Or you can find it on DriveThruRPG or TinyD6.com.
Okay, TinyD6.com. Fantastic. Yep. And we'll
TinyD6.com is out of date, so if you don't see it there, go to DriveThru first.
Okay, DriveThru. So terrific. We'll direct people there then. Mm-hmm. So my daughter is raised on D&D. Okay, so she's been gaming since she was knee-high to a kobold, and but has not yet ran a game. So she has not gotten behind the screen as of this recording. So when I get my copy of Tiny Cthulhu and we look through it, like you said, there's not a lot of hand-holding. So it's really for dungeon masters who are comfortable with a more streamlined system. Is that what you're telling us?
So if she's comfortable winging it, to an extent, is going to be fine. If she understands, how RPGs work, she's going to be fine. But if she's looking for something where she can roll on a bunch of tables and say, okay, now I have an adventure, well, this isn't that.
Okay.
But that being said, we have 2 adventures coming out for it right away.
Fantastic. And those adventures, will those be supplements, or are those going to be downloads from the website?
Both. They will be PDF downloads you can just grab.
Oh, great. Fantastic.
I think we're planning to sell them for $1 or $2. They'll be pretty cheap. So
on DriveThru.
Yep, and on our website, and they'll come with pre-gens and a fully formed adventure suitable for Tiny Cthulhu. So if you are experienced with role-playing games when it comes to crafting adventures, or you're willing to convert an existing adventure, Tiny Cthulhu is a breeze. You're fine. No concerns. Right? If you're looking for something that's going to have pages of tools to help you build an adventure, this isn't the right book. Oh, it has everything you would expect. It's a full toolkit. So there's a bestiary, there's entries about the different mythos deities, there's spells, there's tomes, there's crazy scientist inventions, there's rules for kind of a pulp play, there's rules for generating mysteries with clues, There's environment traits, so you can travel to weird places like the Dreamlands. There's little entries about all of those things. So it's a full toolkit. What it doesn't have is the tools that tell you how to put those all in place in an adventure.
Right. So it gives the keeper or the dungeon master all the resources he needs to create an amazing adventure. It just doesn't draw all the lines to all the dots on the map. That's the part that takes the little bit of dungeon master experience, right?
That's what I would probably agree with that. Yeah. I would liken it to cooking, right? It's all the ingredients you need and it's all the implements you need. It just doesn't give, maybe it's more like it doesn't give you the measuring cups.
Okay.
Maybe,
okay.
Right? Like, and so, and you know, when I cook, I don't really use measuring cups anyway. I just kind of, hey, some of this, some of that. Hey, I cook like a GM, so that's probably not good. But yeah, something like that is what I would say.
It's fantastic. Well, we're super excited about the Tiny D6 engine, and we're looking forward to the next books. And I know I'm going to start collecting a little personal library of your different genres because I love, as a dungeon master, I get bored and I want to flip the channel at the game table. And, sometimes I want fantasy, sometimes I want post-apocalyptic, sometimes I want Western, but I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel, and I don't want to have to send the players home with homework to learn how to play the new game. So with Tiny D6, I'm going to be able to do all that, and with 1 to 2 to 3 D6s, we're going to be able to play the game and tell some amazing stories and go on some great adventures. And that's what I'm really excited about and looking forward to. Alan, thank you so much for being on the show today. Thank you for sharing with us your backstory. And we can't wait to see what's going to happen next.
Other than that, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's always a lot of fun.